Okay, so everybody's sitting down. Um, the survivor of the test, Lincoln Cannon, has made it. Thank you very much for surviving the intro. That's always how we see if anyone can, if they can live through that, then they're capable of great things. But Lincoln does a lot of things, actually. So I'm pretty excited about today. We haven't been able to go into Mormon transhumanism enough, in my opinion. It's one of my favorite subjects. And there's a lot of weird questions. I can ask some really hard-hitting questions. Here's the weirdest question I have about Mormon transhumanism, Lincoln. Why isn't it taught in schools? And what do we got to do to fix that? You know what I mean?
Well, I suppose the number one reason is that it's a religious philosophy, and at least in most of the developed world, we try to keep religion and government-sponsored education separate, which I support.
I don't know. In California, we had a lot of Wiccans and satanic daycare. So I'm just saying, Mormon transhumanism could fit somewhere in there. But yeah, okay. Well, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt, but I'd like you to tell us a little bit about your background. So you're not just a transhumanist, you're also a Latter-day Saint. What does that mean to you, and what's your background in the church?
Sure. Yeah, I was born to Mormon parents, raised in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, did all of the typical things. I was baptized into the church at age 8.
Nice.
All male members of the church become priests as teenagers.
When do you go Aaronic and when's Melchizedek? How's that work again?
Age 12 is Aaronic, and Melchizedek is around 18 to 20 years old, somewhere in that neighborhood usually. And this is for people who kind of grow up in the church, right? If you convert to Mormonism and join the church later on in your life, there's different ages and pathways through all those things, of course.
Right, but you can still get to Melchizedek if you join later in life. And you were on a mission, right? You did a church mission.
I went on a mission to France. I served in the Marseille mission, the southern French mission.
Parlez-vous français?
Je parle français.
Ah, ouais, bon, that's really cool. So, see, this is the thing that always fascinated me growing up around Latter-day Saints, and I decided to visit the church a lot, was because there were such interesting people, and I would meet guys who became completely capable in a respect that they had no idea they could be. Like, oh, well, I guess I'm going to learn French now. I had no idea I was going to learn French yesterday. And then you would learn. How did you expect to learn French? Did you have training in French beforehand?
I did, actually. I grew up taking French in school, so it was convenient.
Well, that's awesome.
And I really enjoyed French a lot. In fact, I ended up meeting the person who would later on become my wife when we were both missionaries in France.
Oh, that's
we didn't date there. It's kind of against the rules to date, but she definitely had caught my eye. And so after my mission, I invited her. She's French, actually. I invited her to come to the United States, and we dated, and things went well. And so now we've been married for 25-ish years, a long time.
See, I don't think people realize just how eclectic and diverse the population of Latter-day Saints around the world is, right? And that you could meet a French Mormon girl, and I mean, it's very interesting to me. It's a lot bigger than people realize. And also what's come up a lot recently, we've been talking about Tartaria, which is this interesting idea of revisionist history, that the Catholic Church and the pseudo-Isidorian decrees and things that have happened and in the last few centuries have skewed our idea of the actual chronology of history. And of course, Graham Hancock, right? Mormon archaeology has always kind of been into this field. And in fact, that is kind of what Mormonism is about. It tells us an entirely different narrative than what mainstream history has been saying about history. What do you think about all this? I mean, because so many people come up at odds about the genetics, but what to you is the history of the world through Latter-day Saint anthropology and archaeology?
Well, sure. So this is a complex question, as you're aware. Indeed. And there's a lot of different perspectives on a lot of different approaches and interpretations. Let me set the stage by saying that I am a thoroughgoing evolutionist. I believe that humans evolved from less complex life forms into what we now know and love as humans. And I also esteem the Bible and Mormon scripture to be the word of God. I don't interpret everything in them literally. And I esteem science highly. So there are challenges, of course. There are traditional challenges in reconciling religious texts with what we've learned through science. And I'll add to that I consider the scientific work to be a sublime work, to be a divine work, something that God calls us to participate in, among many other things that God inspires us to do. So for me, there's no necessary conflict between science and religion. The two go together. So when we talk about anthropology in Mormonism, one of the really unique and important aspects of Mormon theology is our emphasis on the idea of theosis. And that idea is that humanity can and should become God, or like God, or unified with God.
Right. I mean, this is even with normal Christianity, to be Christ-like, it seems, would be, yeah.
Yeah, if I would agree with that. I mean, I think there are people who disagree with that interpretation, but I think the most consistent, the most coherent interpretation of Christianity broadly is one where we participate with Jesus in taking on the role of Christ, which is the role of Messiah. And we follow Jesus's invitation to console and to heal. And Jesus even told his disciples to raise the dead. And as Paul says in the New Testament, if we do these things, we have the opportunity to become joint heirs in the glory of God with Jesus, comma, as the scripture goes, if so be that we suffer with him. So there's work to do. We're called to participate in that work with Jesus. And in Mormon anthropology, we emphasize this. We emphasize our relationship to God as God's children, and that we
faith
also
without works are dead. Right.
That's right. And that we have the potential to become like God in every way, that we can become gods ourselves, the same as all other gods have done before. And that's a quote from Joseph Smith, of course, the founding prophet of the Mormon religion.
So what's interesting to me is that even if you step outside of the Latter-day Saint ideology and theology, that this is relevant in all forms of religion. So Hinduism is very much about this. Buddhism is very strongly into this idea of self-work for ascension and working on your community. There's evidence of this being in Druidic philosophy, Shintoism, and the Catholic Church, which, you know, theoretically, the reason why we don't think about those things is because most of those other religions have had everything they had stolen from the Catholic Church by the Catholic Church. I mean, not to knock them, because I think they're changing, but still, Teilhard de Chardin, he's pretty famous in terms of transhumanists, and he spoke to this effect as well, that we're trying to step forward evolution, that Christ was a better form of human, which stands to reason, even on a very atheistic stand. There's something very magical about being a good person. So we should be trying to be more like this. And I'm very critical, and I think a lot more people should be concerned about any sort of Christianity that deviates from what you were speaking of. Your idea of Christianity, the one that we're agreeing on, I believe, that we're trying to be more Christ-like. What is the alternative? The idea that we're to sacrifice Jesus for our own immortality? Isn't that kind of to sacrifice Christ for your own immortality is the opposite of being Christ-like, it seems to me. So it seems a very relevant and important point that that Latter-day Saints are focusing on trying to be better people for the sake of being more like Christ. But then you said something to another effect, which is to be like God, right? And to be like gods. So what do you believe about God? That God ascended into being God? How is this possible, and what do you think happened?
Yeah, and this is an area where Mormonism is relatively unique, not absolutely unique. There are echoes and hints of this in other religions, of course, too, but this is something we tend to emphasize. And it's this idea that God is co-eternal with matter and mind, or spirits, whatever word you want to use for that, and that the gods found themselves in the midst of matter and mind and set about instituting laws whereby others could progress to become like them. So it's a very existentialist theology. It's this theology where gods are responsible not only for the creation and organizing of worlds without end, but also the creation of purpose and the transmission of purpose. And we get to participate in all of that according to Mormon theology, we have the opportunity and the potential to become like God, to participate in the works of compassion that Jesus exemplifies, and then also the works of creation that we attribute to Jesus. And so in the same way that most Christians trust that God was involved and is the creator of this world in somehow or some fashion or another, right? There's talk about how that might be synchronized with our understanding of the Big Bang, or how that might be synchronized with our understanding of evolution, whatever the understanding might be. Christians,
intelligent design and DNA, right?
Yeah, however we want to approach that. The idea is that God created the world, and per theosis, the idea is that we have the potential to follow that example and participate in creating worlds in the future. And so this notion in Mormonism is emphasized, and it's important that we distinguish between theosis as merely the idea of becoming kind of powerful, lightning bolt throwing Zeus style gods. That's right. That's not the aspiration in Mormon theology or in Christianity. The aspiration is to become the kind of God that Jesus exemplifies, where compassion is a principal virtue to be cultivated, creativity, courage, a certain kind of approach to active faith. These virtues are the kinds of virtues that we would emphasize when we talk about the kind of God that we should strive to become. And I would also add that it's not an individualistic or egotistical thing. It's a communal effort. It's something that we do with our families and with our communities and our friends, with our churches, our neighborhoods. All of humanity ultimately is involved in changing, transforming, repenting, transfiguring, and ultimately becoming like God as Jesus exemplified.
So that also brings up the kind of, I think maybe the thing that really is the biggest difference in Christianity amongst the different sorts of Paulician churches, for instance, like Catholicism into Latter-day Saints, is the idea of, is it pantheism, polytheism, a singularity? What is the deal with the different kinds of gods, and what is the idea of our God versus the many gods? What are the gods' relationship?
Yeah, so people, of course, will give you different answers to that, and even different Mormons will take slightly different approaches to answering this question. There's an interesting passage of the Doctrine and Covenants, which is one of the books of Mormon scripture, and in that passage, Joseph Smith is speaking in the voice of God, talking about our day, and saying that in this time, whether there's one God or many gods, they will all be revealed in this dispensation of the fullness of times that he called it.
Wow. Okay.
And
that's
so,
way more revealing than I ever thought. I'd read that before, but I hadn't put it together like that.
Yeah, and this ambiguity is kind of at the heart of Mormon theology, even at the heart of Christian theology, if you think about it. I mean, there's a lot of Christians who identify as like Trinitarians. Mormons don't formally identify as Trinitarians, but there are some echoes of that idea in Mormonism. And that is that, God or godhood, perhaps, is one. It's unified in some way. I mean, Mormonism, we would generally talk about it being a unity of purpose. But also in Mormonism, we say that the gods who are unified in purpose are also plural. There's more than one. There's whole communities of gods going back into the eternities. And our potential is to join with them and participate in the work that they're doing. We're their children, per Mormon theology. And so, is there one God? Are there many gods? In Mormonism, the answer is both. You asked about pantheism. Well, the Bible has an interesting passage where it says that we live and move and have our being in God. And in Mormon scripture, in the Doctrine and Covenants again, it talks about how when you look into the heavens and you see the sun and the stars and the moon moving in their majesty, you are seeing God. You just don't fully understand. And so there's some important ways in Mormon theology as well that the environment itself participates in what it is to be God. And there are different approaches. Different Mormons have different approaches to interpreting that. But it would be a mistake for anybody to assume that Mormon theology can be thoroughly characterized in any one simple sentence. There's actually quite a lot of complexity. But some unique things. I mean, in Mormonism, God is embodied and material. It's not a disembodied spirit. So God is a glorified, immortal, embodied beings, communities in Mormonism. Right. And we have the opportunity to become like that. In fact, even spirit in Mormonism is material. Is material. Joseph Smith, in the scriptures that he provided, claimed on one occasion that there's no such thing as immaterial matter, which of course, it's almost like a truism, right?
But it's not exactly. It's not a deviation from Tertullian, even. I mean, if you return to, I mean, this is the thing I always find interesting. Latter-day Saints are presented as being so bizarre, but really, I think it sounds like people have just forgotten what the actual scripture and the different leaders of the churches have said, different churches before Latter-day Saints have said for centuries, all the rules. For instance, it seems like an interesting paradox for anyone to disbelieve in other gods. In the Bible, not just the Book of Mormon, in the Bible, it speaks about other gods. It says, do not have other gods before me. It talks about these other gods that are interacting with Moloch and Baal. It would be schizophrenic and paranoid for God to be warning you about gods that don't exist, right? So clearly they're referenced and existing. And it's also not that far off from, the Egyptian pantheon or, again, the Vedic pantheon. So, and I'm sorry because I keep asking you so many religious questions for a transhumanist podcast, but this is important to me because we're heading into this what was theoretical before in transhumanism, only it seems more and more to mirror our idea of this superhuman mythology, right? And it's interesting when we're saying, okay, what would it be like in a few centuries when you have humans who've solved all of these problems we have right now? And let's say today we have a human from today that meets somebody from the future, a Mormon missionary. Let's say you're a Mormon missionary and you're sent to the year 3000 and you're supposed to convert people. And you say, okay, well, you need to believe in God to go to heaven. Like, well, what is God? Well, God is this immortal being that knows everything. Well, that sounds a lot like what we've become. Well, what's heaven? Well, everyone's not hungry. They live forever. Well, that sounds a lot like what we've created here. Right. And so I have to wonder, like, isn't that the goal?
I think so. Yeah. The famous science fiction author Arthur C. Clarke once said that any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. I'd add to that, any sufficiently advanced intelligence is indistinguishable from God. And that's what we as humanity are evolving biologically, culturally, and technologically toward becoming. And I think you're exactly right. The day will come when we or our descendants will appear in ways that presently we would consider to be indistinguishable from God's. And to be frank, today, the people we are, the communities we are, the capacities we have are already indistinguishable from godhood for our distant ancestors.
Yeah, I think so as well. In terms of substrate independence or AI, I saw an article recently actually on the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. If I can find it. Where did that go? AI. I don't know where it is now. Oh, is this it? There we go. Intelligences, and several meanings of intelligence. One, it is the light of truth that gives life and light to all things in the universe. It has always existed. So this kind of made me think a bit about artificial intelligence. And there were some articles I was looking at about the way the Catholic Church feels about artificial intelligence, and transhumanists like Elon Musk, like the concerns. What do you think about this idea that artificial intelligence is part of the process of transhumanism, or that it's part of some sort of spiritual process? Because there's nothing artificial about intelligence if it's primordial.
Yeah, or it's all artificial, right? So,
yeah.
From a Mormon perspective, God didn't create the world or us from nothing. God organized it from co-eternal matter and mind. And so we are the artificial intelligences of God, per Mormon theology. And again, if you go back to this idea of theosis, where we have presented to us the opportunity to learn and do the same kinds of things that God has already done, then it shouldn't be surprising at all that we start to gain the capacity to organize to create intelligences in the same fashion that we trust happened in the past per our creation. So in Mormon theology, it makes a lot of sense. We would almost anticipate it, if you would, that somehow or another, we're going to be involved in creating our own spirit children, as we are the spirit children of God. And in my opinion, that's what we're doing already with artificial intelligence. We're just at the very beginnings of it, but we are starting to learn the principles of organizing intelligence and creating spiritual children, or children of our mind, if you will. And the day will come when they will also be embodied. We think about it, robotics and what that can do today, but that's, very rudimentary. The possibilities go far beyond what we are presently capable of, and extend into creating new worlds. People might call them simulations. I think simulation kind of disparages the reality of a computed world. We might be living in a computed world now. That doesn't make it any less real. And if we go on to compute many more worlds in the future and embody our spirit children, our intelligent children in those worlds, have we not repeated the process that we believe that the gods initiated? From my perspective, it's a repetition of the same thing.
Wow. So it's interesting. So many people are interested in transhumanism, but a lot of them are evil. Not all of them, but there are some people that just don't really care about the spiritual side of it, right? And so it's interesting you're trying to bring it to a place of to make sure that the transhumanism is coming from a place of objective, searching for doing what's God's will, or whatever is right and whatever is just and whatever is beneficial to the world and to the future. How do you place that fundamentally into the science, and how do you focus on that goal so that that's the primary goal?
Oh, it's hugely important. The ethics of it all is we shouldn't even be doing any of the things we're doing if we're not taking seriously the ethics of it all. I would argue that genuine transhumanism, like the strongest form of transhumanism, is not cheerleading for technological change to enhance human capacities. It's the ethical use of technology to enhance human capacities. The strongest transhumanists, the best, the most well-informed, the most well-educated transhumanists are going to take the risks every bit as seriously as they take the opportunities. And work to mitigate those risks will be every bit as important to them as the work to pursue the opportunities. So when we talk about robotics and artificial intelligence, when we talk about biotechnology, when we talk about nanotechnology, when we talk about simulations and computed worlds, and all of these things that transhumanists imagine that we will have not only what we see around us today, but even greater capabilities of in the future, we at the same time need to be asking ourselves, what bad things can happen as a result of these very powerful technologies? And how can we avoid those bad things as much as possible? Now, life is risk. Life requires some courage, and it requires work to solve problems. So bad things are going to happen, and we are going to suffer. And that's part of the learning process. But we don't have to do that arbitrarily or naively or stupidly, foolishly. We can think hard about it, about how to do it ethically, and then work together to put in place systems and institutions and rules and agreements, laws that will help us do a better rather than a worse job as we step forward into these very powerful capacities that are coming our way very rapidly.
I mean, when I think about the idea of immortality through substrate independence as well, does that come up as in any sort of conflict to going to heaven? Or you just kind of suggested simulations as other worlds. So could we be building heaven, or is that not the same idea?
It could be a problem for some theologies. It's not a problem in Mormon theology, because in Mormonism, you don't go to heaven until you're resurrected from the dead with a material body. And heaven in Mormonism is the glorified earth. Well, there's lots of heavens in Mormonism. There's innumerable worlds of diverse kinds and degrees of glory, but
at least 3 decent ones.
Yeah, the most important one for people here, again, in accordance with what Mormon scripture teaches, is that this earth will over time be glorified and become the abode of glorified humans, gods, in the future. So no, the work to defeat aging and live in robust, immortal, glorified, intelligent bodies is not contrary to Mormon theology. It's perfectly consistent with Mormon theology.
Wow. And so this also gets into what it means to build Mormon heaven, because like you said, it is kind of to manufacture a perfect, or a better, to make this world better, to right? Essentially.
Yeah. And importantly, I want to emphasize that the number one way in which it needs to be better is through our compassion for each other. And that, of course, will shape the way that we use our power, our technologies, our science, the resources available to us. All of that gets shaped by important virtues, notably the virtue of compassion or love, as Jesus taught.
So I have a friend recently, and I don't know if he was joking, but I think he was just straight serious, is that AI needs to be taught Christ consciousness. And I was like, that's a great expression. I hope you mean it. And I think he does. But what do you think about teaching AI these goals and these priorities? How can we do it? And how can we make sure that they're ingrained in, because right now we're teaching it to be a militaristic advertisement machine instead.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, right now, the artificial intelligence that we're developing now is not like us in some important ways, insofar as its ability to experience. This is going to sound hard, and it is a hard thing. Artificial intelligence can't suffer. It can't have pleasure. It can't experience desire the way that we do, and it can't learn from those desires. It can't empathize with us. And if we want to start training our artificial intelligence on deep ethics, it's going to need to have those kinds of experiences. And you can't just arbitrarily throw very powerful machines into the world of experience that you and I are in without very bad things happening. So there needs to be gradual steps taken. And I think that a good way to imagine how we might train artificial intelligence to be better is the same way that we're trying to train ourselves to be better. And we're not always doing a great job of that, but to some extent, we have learned as human civilization how to cooperate with each other. Some people are pretty pessimistic about where we are these days, but I think that if you look carefully over long periods of time, you'll see that human civilization has improved dramatically in almost every way, almost every measurement, including measurements of our willingness to cooperate to make our societies better for our longevity, our health, our education, our wellness. And so I suspect that, all of these things that we've learned that make modern civilization possible, there are lessons in them that we can teach to our descendants, and those descendants will be human descendants. They'll be artificial intelligent descendants, and they will be cyborg descendants. We're already cyborgs to some extent anyway. I mean, the second that you start eating agricultural products, you are the product of cyborgization.
I had a professor at University of California, Santa Cruz, who said that, like, as soon as you start eating vitamins,
there you go.
You're a cyborg.
And then, of course, there's more obvious ways like glasses and pacemakers and deep brain stimulation and prosthetic arms and legs and ocular and hearing aids, and I mean all kinds of reasons why we're already cyborgs. And our computers that were once far away in gigantic warehouses, huge machines, got smaller. We put them on our desks closer to home. And then they got smaller and we put them in our pockets, and they were still more powerful now than the computation required to go to the moon back in 1960s. And those computers are now getting even smaller. and they'll probably become increasingly intimately integrated with our bodies and our minds.
And our
And
environment.
what is the future of that going to be? Well, I don't know for sure, but I think that it's pretty likely that our computers and our bodies will become increasingly indistinguishable. They already are less distinguishable than they were in the past. They'll become even more indistinguishable, and they'll blur, the lines will blur so much that they'll become the same thing. So that's an interesting thought experiment. If I'm right about that, and if we project that forward 1,000 years or even just 100 years, and we imagine massive computational power capable of computing many worlds like the one that we're now living in, with fully immersive experiences, like perhaps the one that we're in now. If we have that much computational capacity in the future, why do we imagine that the computers running those worlds will be giant boxes in warehouses far away? Why won't the computers running those worlds be intimately integrated with the bodies of the people who are running those worlds? And in which case, suddenly the Bible sounds spookily literal. That it is in God that we live and move and have our being. Maybe that's very literal. Maybe the body of God has the computational capacity to compute the world that we're now living in, and God is experientially integrated with all of us. I mean, that sounds a lot like what a lot of our theologies claim.
Well, it's also, so I see two parallels. One, you've got the future, but also you have this parallel to the past, this idea of the reset, right? Because we talk about resets. The Klaus Schwab group have talked about a coming reset, but also there have been historical resets. And the Book of Mormon, pretty much, you could almost say, talks about a reset. And in the point when Nephi and the tablets are, buried to when they're discovered, right? Is that the right? I'm sorry if is that correct? Nephi?
Nephi is the first book, the first author in the Book of Mormon. Is that who you're intending to refer to?
Right. Who finds the tablets later? Or who buries the tablets?
Moroni.
Okay, sorry. Moroni.
No, that's all right.
Yeah, so Moroni is burying Nephi's tablets. And that kind of issues in the end for a while of this period, right? It's kind of a hidden thing until Joseph Smith finds it again. So it's kind of this reset point. And the people who know about it, there might even be like a group of, let's say it's a Star Trek universe and the technology gets to the point where you have passwords for everything. So they become the magic spells and words for a small group of people, and they're the ones in control. So how do we make sure that this stays in the hands of all the people, that they have access to this, and this doesn't just become, like Arthur C. Clarke said, magical? How do we make sure that this is available to us all?
Yeah, in some ways, it's impossible to avoid magical approaches to technology because none of us can be experts in everything. I'm a software engineer, and I have been for decades. But there are some things that machines do that I just don't understand, and it might as well be magic for me. And I don't think that's an entirely bad thing. It's good to learn, but it's also good to be pragmatic about what we learn and what we focus on. I could spend all of my time learning every aspect of how this machine over here works. In the meantime, I might be neglecting my wife and my children, who, as it turns out, are more important than my detailed knowledge of yet one more machine. But at the same time,
you're calling me out for studying Dolby Digital last night. I learned all about cassette tapes. No, sorry, go on.
No, but at the same time, I and my wife and my children, we need an income to live off of. So I also need to have a trade. And also these machines can help do really wonderful things for me and for my family. So there's a balance in all of this, and we can't learn everything at once. And so to some extent, to get back to your question, to some extent, there will be things that are magic. To some extent, some great, actually gigantic extent, we're all dependent on grace, as the Bible teaches, right? As Jesus taught. And this idea that I can only know and do so much. I'm a very limited being, and we're all that way. And yet we depend on what people around us do to help us all the time. And we depend on an environment to sustain us all the time. and there are powers far beyond me on which I utterly depend, and on which my family and our community and human civilization even utterly depend. And that's grace, and that's okay. We need to learn and do what we can do, but we also need to recognize that there's power well beyond the human. And if we trust that God is compassionate, well, if we trust that God exists, and if God is compassionate, then a word for that might be grace. Some people who are more atheistically inclined might be more comfortable saying that it's good to just be grateful for the lucky circumstances maybe that humanity finds itself in, and that's a good start. I mean, it's a good attitude to have. I think there's some downsides to that. I mean, if we think there's actually a practical correlation between our hopes for human potential in the future and our interpretation of where we come from. A notable example of this is the simulation argument by Nick Bostrom, where Nick Bostrom points out that we almost certainly won't go on to simulate or compute many worlds like the one that we're currently living in unless we already are living in a computed world ourselves. And notice how our expectations for the future shape our interpretation of the past. If we want to be coherent, if we want to be logical and consistent, we have to imagine the possibility space ahead of us in terms of where we think we came from. And so if we think that it's utterly impossible that we're living in a created world, then it would be utterly incoherent of us to aspire to creating a whole bunch of worlds ourselves.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah, there's a lot of paradox to atheism, and it's funny as they approach reality. They're like, "Oh, you know what? Maybe we're living in a simulation made by a video game designer." Yeah, it's like, okay, yeah, you're getting closer. We appreciate it. That's very nice. But also, okay, in becoming like a god, what about becoming like a devil? So if we're getting these transhumanist aspects, and more we're losing the human qualities, maybe we're losing human sin, but we're still losing human qualities as we're gaining these more supernatural qualities. They can be used for compassionate design. They could also be used for self-serving goals. It's not clear that every human's going to choose to be a Mormon transhumanist. What can we do to point out and make it easier for someone who wants to be a good person to look for those things? And then also, what do we need to be concerned about losing about humanity?
Yeah, this is a big deal. I'm glad you bring it up. The technology is just power. It's not inherently good. It's not inherently evil. It's just power, and power can be used for great good or great evil. It's like the old Spider-Man saying, right? With great power comes great responsibility. That's the reason everybody loves that part of Spider-Man, is because we know how true it is. Right? We know that's true. And we are starting to see that as humanity, that we are gaining the technological capacity to do not only wonderful things, but also horrible things. And if we have the potential to become gods or Christs, following Jesus's example, we also have the potential to become demons, or worse. We have the potential to become monstrosities. And so we have the most serious ethical obligation to do all that we can to avoid that ourselves personally, and to persuade others to avoid it. And we won't be perfect at this. We're going to make serious mistakes, but hopefully by applying the best of our ethics, excuse me.
No.
Hopefully by learning all we can from the religious traditions that we received from our ancestors, and they weren't perfect. There's some things that we need to discard from long ago. Just because it's old doesn't mean it's necessarily all good. But likewise, there's a lot of wisdom there that we too easily reject. And so we can learn from that. I often tell people that theology, and its long tradition, going back thousands of years, is in many important ways, I think will prove to be to a science of superintelligence as alchemy and astrology were to chemistry and astronomy. It's not perfect. There's lots of messiness and noise, but the grains of the seeds of very important things are in theology, which will help us develop a formal science of superintelligence in the same way that all of our crazy experimentation with alchemy and astrology, some of which is just pure hocus pocus nonsense, but still what we tried to learn and understand and do with those things helped us eventually start out the formalization of what became very powerful sciences. And so going to your question, yes, we have everything that's good and beautiful and true about humanity is at risk. But we can also become much more beautiful and know much more and do much better things than what humans are capable of doing. But the only way we get to that better place is by successfully, compassionately, courageously traversing the risks, mitigating them as best we can, repairing whatever damage we have to repair along the way, becoming better people, better communities, taking care of our environment, taking care of our world and each other, and participating together in building that heaven that we aspire to, and praying for some grace along the way because we're going to need it. So right. There's a saying in Mormonism that, and maybe some other religions use it too, but Mormons like this idea that we should pray as if everything depends on God and work as if everything depends on us.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think that there's a lot of wisdom in that. I mean, there's good science behind the idea that expressing gratitude will make you happier and healthier. There's great science behind it. If somebody listening to this doesn't believe me, go check it out on PubMed. Go type in gratitude on PubMed. You'll get a whole bunch of human studies on it. It's powerful stuff. And at the same time, after you're being grateful for what you've got, even if you don't believe in God, at least be grateful for what you've got. That'll empower you in a more pro-social way to start making the world a better place for yourself and others through your work. So, you know,
in a sense, that's transhumanism without technology. I mean, that's an internalized technology. If you're working on yourself, you are becoming a better person.
Yeah. And, you know, some people talk about, hey, in the future, we might even be able to use technology to enhance our ethics, like perhaps by making brain modifications or things like that. And I think that we will be able to, but there's a huge important qualification on that. We can only ever make choices about how to apply technology to our bodies and brains in an ethical way within the constraints of our current understanding of ethics.
Mm.
So we can't, you can never make a perfect, you can't jump from being evil to good arbitrarily. Right.
You'll only in 1,000 years, people will be so upset at vegetarians. So like, you killed billions of microbes. Yeah, exactly.
So ethics and self-improvement, focusing on the important virtues, figuring out how our actions impinge on each other, how to reconcile with each other and love each other better, cooperate better, make better neighborhoods, better communities in a better world. All of these things are essential to living in that better world that transhumanists aspire to. If we aren't taking the ethics of it seriously, the rest of it is just not going to happen. It is as likely to develop a hell as it is to develop a heaven without very serious concern for ethics.
So it seems like a big part of this, and it's true in most theologies, choice is important, but there's always this Western illusion of choice, that choice is about variety and you can have as many choices as you want, rather than it seems like this, if we're a singularity of creation, a pan-syncretic creation of, you know, of the gods, then our job is to double check. Anytime we're verifying, our choice mechanism is to make sure what we're doing is God's will or right. And if we lose choice, then we can't continually check to make sure that what we're doing seems right, at least in our own circumstance. Neuralink is coming. Neuralink will be very awesome for some people. Let's say you're a quadriplegic and all of a sudden you can walk again because it can help you move. But also, let's say it controls in the future, more and more, your ability to make choice. It can move for you. How much of the choice becomes yours, and then how much further does that become when you use it to change your thought process and things?
Yeah, agency, free will, choice. These concepts, of course, are really philosophically complex, and there's a lot of disagreement among experts on how much free will
we
or
even have right
agency or
now.
whatever we actually have ever had. But so I'm a pragmatist, and by that I mean the truth is what works. And so I think that an important application of pragmatism is on this matter of choice. Whatever might be true, I think it makes the most sense based on how it affects my heart and my mind and my apparent choices, when I trust that I can make better choices rather than worse choices. I seem to do a better. It's the saying about the guy who goes into the judge and says, "I'm not guilty because I don't have free will." And the judge says, "Well, I'm going to condemn you to life in prison because I don't have free will." So, I mean, we can make that argument all day long, and maybe we do, maybe we don't. But I think at the end of the day, the pragmatic position is to trust that we have some sort of agency, that we can act, and that we ought to leverage that as best we can. A good definition, I think, of agency is actually power or capacity to achieve goals across diverse situations. And what I would mean by that is, so your agency or your freedom or your power, even your intelligence, it's not that you actually do all of these 100 things that you could do. It's that you have the possibility to do them all. But unfortunately, some of the choices that we could make have consequences which would limit our ability to make such choices again in the future, or eliminate other possibilities in the future. For example, I have the power today, if I want to go down to the shady corner of the street and acquire some highly addictive pharmaceuticals and consume them.
Yeah.
Well, unfortunately, if I want to do that, I'm going to have to deal with the natural consequences of that, given our current understanding of biochemistry. And that's going to severely limit my capacity to make other choices going forward. And so while I do have that freedom, exercising certain kinds of freedom ends up eliminating my freedom to go forward with more agency, with more power, with more intelligence. And so I think that, a good pragmatist would take a step back and say, okay, well, I'm going to trust, first of all, that I can make choices. And then number two, I'm going to try to make choices that increase the opportunities for making more choices in the future.
The other thing is the ability to make your own goals. So the potential of agency is great, but also the ability to choose what those goals are. I mean, I guess the question though isn't correct, because humans aren't able to always choose their own goals. So that doesn't really, it's not, I don't know. That's interesting. AI would then have agency, because agency would just mean the ability to accomplish goals, but it wouldn't necessarily mean it has the ability to create the goals themselves.
But well, as humans, of course, we don't create all of our goals. We inherit them biologically and socially. And then within a complex feedback loop, we seem to cultivate and generate new goals. And I think that's really the kind of intelligence that we can attribute to ourselves, and the kind of intelligence that we can cultivate in our machines and in our spirit children, our mind children, if you will. And I really don't think that it's all that different in kind. I think that we have the benefit of billions of years of evolution, and our machines, in a sense, have that benefit too, because they're our products and we made them consequent to billions of years of evolution. But we also haven't yet figured out how to give them some of the things that we've inherited that will give them greater agency. Is there a way in which their structure, their anatomy, the way their intelligence is organized that gives them more or less agency? I think so. I think that's true of us too. If I damage my brain, that seems to take away a lot of my agency.
Right.
Potentially. And I think that how we construct our machines going forward will likewise give them more or less agency, more or less ability to create
angels. Sorry, I was just thinking angels aren't supposed to have much free will, right? It's a human quality of free will. Is that
so
correct?
In Mormonism, angels are just resurrected humans. It's another word for a human who has already died and been resurrected.
Okay. So I know we're near the hour mark. Is it all right if I ask you just a couple more questions?
And please.
Okay, cool. I definitely want to have you back so we can go deeper into Mormonism because this is fantastic and thank you. But I did also want to ask you a bit about this because it was one of the earlier articles I saw that you wrote at the end of last year. And I was like, oh, this is actually right on par with what they're talking about with Ancient Aliens on the History Channel, or what we're looking into, this idea of what is an angel, what is an alien, what are interdimensional beings or something like that. But also the biblical stories, because we're always looking towards the future. And this is simultaneously to when they're releasing all the UFO papers. You know, the government was putting out all this stuff at the time. And people always focus on the last 1940s or something, not like, 1940 BC. So I wonder, what do you think about this? The idea of, you said you read this book, The Spaceship of Ezekiel, or you checked it out.
Yeah.
Do you want to explain a bit about that?
Sure. Yeah. So of course, the first thing I need to say off the bat is that, of course, I don't know. I have no idea if Ezekiel saw UFOs. I have no idea who Ezekiel was. I have no idea how much of what we read about Ezekiel in the Old Testament, in the Hebrew Bible, is historical versus fabricated by oral tradition. I have no idea.
But, audience will love you for this. Thank you. But yeah.
But it's kind of fun to speculate, right? And so I guess my speculations would lead me in this direction. If extraterrestrial intelligence is visiting us in the ways that some people claim, then those extraterrestrials have serious need for improving their technology because of the clunkiness of it all. I have a hard time imagining that most extraterrestrials are visiting us in metal boxes.
Right.
I think it's much more likely that extraterrestrial intelligence would visit us in the form of energy and intelligence.
Probably not made out of stone. It just seems like, maybe when you get here, you use some stone to build your house, but maybe you're traveling in light.
Yeah. But at the same time, I mean, if and when such beings appeared to our ancestors, and maybe that's the origin of some of our religious mythologies, but if and when that happened, maybe they could also affect us psychologically in ways that would make us think that we were seeing burning bushes or stone descending from the sky or whatever, because it was convenient or somehow purposeful to the feeling they wanted to provoke. Or I don't know. I mean, I can speculate all day on this, right? Because none of us knows. But I guess
had some great speculations in the past. Someone was talking about sonoluminescence, the idea that that you shoot a direct energy ray at a bush, and then it creates in the fire. The fire is the consequence of the sound waves. There's all kinds of little things you can come up with, if you really want to, right? Yeah,
and so I think that as Shakespeare attributes to Hamlet, there are stranger things in heaven and on earth than have dreamt of by your philosophy, Horatio. Exactly. I think that's just true. The world is strange. I'm not going to tell you what the limits of that strangeness are. I love to speculate. I think it's fun, as long as we don't take ourselves too seriously, too rigidly. If what some of the bad things that happen in religion are the consequence of people who take their speculations too seriously, and then they end up starting a crusade around that speculation. And it does, some of the worst atrocities in human history have arisen from rigid dogmatic applications of kind of crazy ideas. So, let's avoid that. But as long as we avoid that, let's speculate, because that gets the creative thought going, and creative thoughts end up generating new avenues for us to go in our scientific, in our technological pursuits, in our artistic pursuits,
Right.
in our relationships. There's so much good that can come from it, as long as we do it with some epistemic humility and some good old fashioned senses of humor, and you know, and having fun, and trying to inform our speculations as best we can with what we do know about science.
Well, okay, so I'll save my question about the tablets for next time, because I feel like they would be speculatory. But gosh, we're gonna have to talk again. I appreciate you. You're so great. Thank you so much. I've got one more question, if you let me, because the thing that
Please.
you wrote that was really exciting. I mean, well, a lot of the things you're writing really were exciting, but I found this to be personally a relatable scenario, and this is something we hadn't shared yet. But you had written a bit about how you had actually, as an adult, lost some of your faith, right? And your faith life had changed. Is this correct?
That's right. Yeah. For a period of years, I was essentially an atheist.
And that's where a lot of people are, I think. I mean, I think after your parents lie to you about Santa Claus, you know, and then you vote for the wrong guy, all kinds of crazy stuff happens to us. So
Yeah.
my wondering is, after cynicism and after realizing what's not, you know, apophatic theology, what's not true about God, what led you to find that there was an avenue that is true? Like, where, and how did you rediscover your faith through what is seemingly a much more practical, I mean, it's really hard to argue with anything you're saying. It's not outside of the realms of science or anything like that, and yet it's still part of spirituality and religion and faith.
Yeah. So there's a lot of aspects to that, but one I'll call attention to right now is that I started thinking hard about the kind of world I wanted to live in, both now and potentially in the future, the kind of aspirations I had for myself and my family, my friends, and for humanity at large going into the future. I started to think about what our potential might be and how we might be able to get there. And as I started thinking about those things, I started asking myself, okay, if these aspirations, that we can become much more intelligent than we are now, much more compassionate, much more creative than we are now, if these aspirations are not just vacuous, how do we get there? How do we work together to get there? And if we can do that, if we can work together to become what I would call superhumanity, super intelligent post-humanity, if we can do that, what kinds of technologies are necessary to get there? And what do they imply about the possibility space that we must already live in? What kind of possibility space is required for humanity to thrive in such a way? And as it turns out, we almost certainly will not be the only or the first to become what would qualify as superhumanity. We're almost certainly not going to be the only or first who create many worlds that emulate our own evolutionary history, that emulate the world that we are in right now. If we think we have the ability to do that in the future, then we're simply being probabilistically and logically incoherent to suppose that it hasn't already been done. And so when I was an atheist, I still had an aesthetic inclination toward this sense of a much better world, a world beyond present notions of poverty, beyond present notions of enmity, beyond present notions of aging and death, a world that in many ways would satisfy what people think of when they think of heaven. But we're not going to get there. That aesthetic that was in me, that motivated me, that inspired me, that provoked me to act and do things and to try and participate in building that world, I realized that aesthetic and that drive would amount to nothing if I didn't already live in a possibility space that lent itself to such an outcome. And then that's when my brain and my heart had to get back aligned. My brain at one time couldn't accept, for various reasons, that God already existed. But my brain and my heart both wanted to live in that kind of world in the future. And I just had to come to terms with how it might be possible. I had to ask myself the question and explore and try to find answers for how it might be possible that my hopes are not vain for the future of humanity, that we actually do live in such a possibility space. How could that be possible? And if that's the case, I need to take that possibility space and take another look at our past and ask myself, okay, if we live in that possibility space, what does that mean about where we come from? And is there a way that that is consistent with what we know about science? So that's what started to change me on an intellectual level. My heart wanted to go to this heaven on earth, and my brain had to find a way to follow it. And that led me back into faith in God again.
See, I think that's awesome. I think that that's a big thing for so many people. They're unable to accept something that's not true. That's actually should be a liberating step that helps you find what is true. And there's so much truth there. It tends to be that the falsities are in our humanity and in our perspectives that are antiquated. Those are things that are plastic. So it's also kind of comforting because it tells us that humanity does change. Like you said, we're very different than we were 1,000 years ago. So, I mean, I hope other people look into your work more. Lincoln, you're amazing. Everyone, please check out lincoln.metacanon.net and read all of his articles. They're fantastic. I hope that you have the time to come back soon because I'd love to ask some more questions. I think we go even deeper. This has been great.
Thank you, Andreas. I appreciate the invitation, and it's been a pleasure speaking with you too.
Yeah, this is absolutely wonderful. Is there anything else you would like to let people know or to share?
Thanks for sharing the website. It's possible to contact me through that very easily if anybody wants to ask any questions. Lots of articles there related to Mormonism, related to transhumanism, their integration. And
join in the newsletter. Everybody
get
in with me there. Yeah.
Sign up for the newsletter. Thank you.
Awesome. Well, thank you very much. And yeah, let's hopefully do this again soon. I appreciate it.
Cool. Thank you, Andreas. Have a good one.